afternoon, everyone. Well, huge thanks to the organizers for having me and to all of you for being here for the last talk of the day. So let's get started. Well, looking at you all right now, I'm reminded of when I sat at the audience of an accessibility talk, much like this one a few years back. And I remember feeling like, okay, this accessibility stuff is really cool, it's really nice, but does it really apply to the thing that I'm building? At the time, I was building a mobile website, and I kept hearing about all this keyboard accessibility stuff. And I thought, well, maybe if I were building a new thing or a different thing. So it felt like there was this huge gap between the thing that I was building and accessibility. And looking back, I'm kind of embarrassed to have sort of been in that place, but I like to own sort of having felt that way, because it helps me appreciate just how easy it is to feel that way about accessibility, and just to feel that accessibility is this thing that's very far away. So fast forward to 2016, I started working at the Financial Times. We were building sort of the greatest, fastest news site in the industry. We released last October to great success. We replaced some old website that I used to have. And we started winning a bunch of awards. We were excelling in performance and security. So basically every metric that we had set our sights on. But one day we decided to look at accessibility. Just maybe we were good at this too. We were excelling at everything else, so maybe this too. But unlike performance and security and all those other things, we had never really put a collective effort into accessibility. So to no surprise, we weren't very good. And since this talk is all about the lessons that we learned, that this was the very first one. Accessibility doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen. So I'm Laura Carvajal. I'm senior developer at the Financial Times. This is an actual picture of our office. We are a magical place with our own rainbow, you see there. I'm the lead developer on the accessibility team. And today I want to tell you about the lessons that we learned in the FT.com team once we realized that this beautiful performant thing that we had built could not be enjoyed by everyone. So if you're in that place where you're wondering if accessibility applies to your project, hopefully today you'll walk away convinced that not only does it apply, but it's very easy to get started. So what is accessibility? There are many definitions out there. There's one that I really like, and it's this one right here. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. That's it. It just boils it down to making sure that we're not denying access to the thing that we're building. That's it. But to go beyond this a little bit, I want to tell you a quick story. I was in a shopping mall in London the other day and with my daughter, and we were going up those escalators that you see there. And as we were going up, she asked me, well, how does someone in a wheelchair do what we're doing? And she's only 10 years old, but she's very aware of accessibility, mostly because I practice my accessibility talks on her. But I was feeling a little proud that she'd asked me this question. I said, well, there's a lift. And she said, well, where is it? And I turned around, and honestly, I couldn't see it. Only when we got to the top of the escalator is that we saw that at the very far end of that corridor, there was actually a lift. So she just looked at me and says, that's not fair. Someone in a wheelchair has to go all the way there, then up, and then all the way back. And I kind of like that moment, because children have a way of seeing things exactly for what they are. And even though this building obviously complied with all the regulations, and it's a pretty modern building, it was obviously not fair. So I kind of like to add to that definition by saying, beyond not denying access to what you're building, we need to make sure that the access we're providing is fair to everyone. So we've covered what accessibility is, but we also mentioned the word disability. So I want to look into that a little bit more. Disability can be roughly divided into 4 categories: physical, visual, hearing, and cognitive. While we may be more familiar with permanent disabilities, so for example, being deaf or hard of hearing is a permanent disability, we also have situational and temporary disabilities. So those closed captions that benefit a deaf person will also benefit every one of us on that spectrum. And I say us because each and every one of us spends some time somewhere on that spectrum during our daily lives. So you may have other reasons why you want to watch that video without audio. So it just goes to show that this is not an us versus them thing, and this is not something that's going to benefit some other people somewhere else. This benefits all of us. As far as permanent disabilities go, about 1 billion people in the world have a disability. That's around 15 to 20% of the population. But when you factor in where your user base is and their age distribution and other demographic characteristics, you'll get a clearer picture of what that number is for your business. So for us at the Financial Times, that worked out to be around 26% of our users. This is partly because our user base skews slightly older. So we go to great lengths to support all the segments of our audience. So for example, if you have, say, 5% of your users are on IE9, you probably want to make sure that they get some sort of experience when they visit your site. So all of a sudden now we have this 26% of people that we were potentially ignoring. So seeing this in numbers in this way tends to be a good motivator to get things started. So let's say I've convinced you. Now you're determined to do this. You want to fix accessibility on your site or on your app or on the thing that you're building. And you're going to be the very best at doing this, but it's scary and it's overwhelming, and there's a bunch of information out there, and it's kind of hard to even know where to start. So our advice is just start small. For us, starting small meant doing that. We installed Pali, and Pali is an open source tool that will check your HTML and automatically detect some accessibility errors. It doesn't detect everything. It detects about 20 to 30% of potential accessibility issues you may have on your site, but it's a really, really great place to start. And there are other tools that do similar things to Pali, but we got started with Pali mostly because it's a very easy tool to use and because it's backed by a great community of developers. So yeah, they're very receptive to contributions, and they are just eager for every time we use the tool and have feedback for them. They're very supportive. So yeah, it's a really great bunch of people. So the way Pali works is it goes through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a list of criteria that accessible websites should meet, and it checks your markup against each one of those items. Then at the end, it gives you a report of what's broken. So we run Pali for the first time. We run it manually like that, basically just palift.com, and it gives back a list of errors. It was initially a lot more than 2. It was like 100 errors or so. And you could go about manually fixing all those, and then in a few weeks, running Pali again, seeing what else cropped up, and then fixing that. But in the type of system that we have that is very, very large, we really needed something more automatic. So that's where Pali CI comes in, which is basically a wrapper around Pali that helps you integrate this into your CI process. It's built by the same people who built Pali. So I want to show you a little bit of what our build process looks like. This is a very oversimplified sort of view of how we build ft.com. We have several node apps. So for example, the front page is an independent app, the article page, sign-up forms, etc. All these apps live in GitHub. And every time we push to a branch, that branch gets built in Circle CI. And if it's the master branch, it gets deployed to Heroku, where it goes live. And Pali CI kicks in this step, in the continuous integration step. So it will run on every push of every branch that you make, and it will tell you if you have accessibility errors. Integrating this into the process that we already had was very simple. We just needed to add a single line to our build process, and what that line did is just run Pali. And Pali CI is very customizable. So in our case, every branch deploys to a test tab with a custom name, and Pali just ran against that. And the most interesting bit here is that threshold argument there. What that does, it will allow Pali to run in CI, and it will allow up to that number of errors without breaking the build. So this is what it looked like in action the first time we integrated it somewhere in one of our apps. The build, as you see, is still green. Everything's still passing, but it started to alert you of errors that you have. So our ultimate goal was to have accessibility errors break each and every build. But when we introduced this to a project, we had hundreds of errors across dozens of apps on a site that deploys dozens of times a day. And we couldn't really hold production and tell everyone, hey, you're going to stop everything you're doing. You're going to fix all these errors before you release any new features. So we couldn't realistically do that, so this was our alternative. We got Pali CI into all of our projects without breaking the builds. And then we went app by app, fixed all the errors in that app, and only then we removed the threshold. So this way, it allowed us to sort of introduce it to the team that was working on that app, and then any new branch that would come in that had accessibility errors, then that branch would break. So it was at that point where it would stop you from adding new errors into production, basically, for that app. So we did this for every app in our ecosystem, about a couple dozen user-facing apps. And once we'd done it for all the apps and removed the threshold on all of those, we felt like winners. We had achieved. I mean, it was a really great moment for the team, because basically we had some assurance that no more accessibility errors would ever make it into the build. But we realized that even though people were for Pali, everyone was very supportive of accessibility. They knew what it was, and they were even excited to have their builds broken and to have this thing that prevents them from introducing errors into production. We didn't really do a great job of explaining how the builds would break or what developers would need to do to fix the things that were broken. So that was the second lesson that we learned. Before you set the build on fire, train people. So we're going to go over a little bit of what Pali actually found and the things it would have been nice to get some training on before we ran into them. So one of the most popular issues we found had to do with color contrast. So this is one example. Our footer, light gray on top of less light gray tends to be an issue. So what we did in this case was adjust the colors a little bit so that the contrast ratio between the two colors, so the text and the background, was about 4.5 to 1, which is sort of the minimum ratio that you want to have good accessibility. So we did that in a bunch of places on the site. And for the most part, it allowed us to keep our original design. So by tweaking the colors, we were able to meet the standard without really changing much visually. But it does make a difference on accessibility. Another popular issue had to do with all text. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines just requires all images to have an alt attribute, and that's it. So Pali will check. So Pali will break if the alt is missing. But then it's up to us to determine what needs to go into that alt. So, you would add some text to describe the image. But depending on the type of image, you would add something different. So we have roughly 3 types of images. Images that are decorative, images that actually convey information, and images that convey really complex information. So let's go over this a little bit. So in the case of decorative images, here's an example of one of those. It's images that don't add anything to the content and are used really as decoration. No pun intended. So in this case, there's really no need to add Trump waves despondently at crowd or whatever, because it really doesn't add anything to the story. So to deal with these, we need to add what they call a null alt or an empty alt. Just add the alt attribute with an empty string that tells screen readers and Pali and other checkers that this image is decorative. But depending on your screen reader settings or your system settings, you may need to add something else. So this is what we do at the Financial Times. Besides the null alt, we add a role of presentation to those images to make sure that no screen reader will pick it up. So we just take it out of the way. Then there's images that convey information. So for example, it's probably too small to read, but that's an article entitled How Donald Trump Won the US Presidency in Pictures. So in this case, the pictures are actually a part of the story. So we could argue that these should have an alt text. And it should be something that makes sense on its own, out of context, but also that makes sense within the story where the images appear. Lastly, we have the images that carry a lot of information, such as infographics or charts or something like this. You may see online a recommendation to use the long desk attribute, but this is actually very poorly supported, and if not deprecated already, it will soon be. So we don't really use this at Financial Times, but we use something kind of equivalent. We still provide an alt text for the image, just as a subject of what the image is, and then we provide a link to a document with an explanation of what the image is. So it's providing alternate formats. So whether you can see the chart or you can read the text, you will get the same information. Another way to deal with this is just to not have PNGs at all. So we could easily do that in SVG, and it's something that we're looking into at the Financial Times. And then you could leverage all the accessibility support that SVGs have. Forms. There's a lot we can and did get wrong with forms. I'm just going to go over two things quickly. Labels and required fields. So in the case of labels, you may have used already the for attribute to link a label to an ID, which is semantically very nice, but it can be very easy to forget, mostly because if you forget, it doesn't break anything visually. So, but this is actually very meaningful for assistive technology. Assistive technologies like screen readers. So a screen reader, for example, if you don't have this relationship, it will read out input to the user without telling them anything else about what needs to be written in that input. But if you do have that relationship, it will read out the actual label, so email input, email address. So yeah, wherever you have forms, always remember to tie your label to your input. Something else was required fields. We used to just say that a field was required by having a star next to the label, and that was it. So that originally just read email address, star, input. So it really said nothing about the field being required. Even though screen reader users kind of used to, when they hear star, that means the field that follows is required. It's a lot better to have the actual required attribute or area required equal true in the actual input that's required. And then you can, ideally you would take out the star out of the label and put it in a div or span that's hidden from screen readers. So the screen reader would read email address, required input, and that's it, no star in the way. Lastly, in this segment, another thing that causes a lot of problems for people who work on accessibility are ads. Well, they have a lot of problems in general, but for accessibility, they're a bit of a pain. And they're third-party code, so there's really not much we can do about them, and they tend to be very broken in terms of accessibilities. But we do have control over our own markup that surround those ads. So what we do is we wrap them in a div, and then we do aria hidden on that div to effectively hide the ad from screen readers, for example, or other assistive technologies, so they don't have to sort of navigate whatever markup just fell into our page, just because they will get nothing out of the ad. Also, ads tend to be sort of an iframe soup in there, what gets injected from Google Ads or wherever else. So, and if you have a lot of iframes in there, if you're tabbing through the page, your tab can get lost inside all that markup there. So what we do is we inject, we dive into that div, and every iframe that we find, we give it a tab index -1 to take it out of the tab order. So if you're tabbing around the page, you will never fall into the ad. So that was one of the most painful problems that we had, and we just solved them with those two things there. Duplicate content is another issue, accessibility issue that's easy to fix. There's sort of two types of duplicate content on your page. You can have content that's the same in two parts of the page, and that means the same in both places, but you just want to have it duplicated. Or content that looks the same but really isn't. So it's two slightly different ways to deal with it. So when the content is the same, like in our article page, we have latest on Russian politics on the right, but we also have it at the bottom of the article. So visually, if you're starting to read the article, you see your related articles here, and as you read the article and you reach the bottom, you see it again there. Something that as a business that we want. But for a screen reader, this can be confusing, and it just crowds the information that the screen reader gives at you, because it's giving you two identical pieces of information irrelevant of where it is on the page. So the solution for this is add ARIA hidden true to all but one of these. So you will still see both on the page, but the screen reader will only announce the one that doesn't have ARIA hidden true. So in our case, we hid, I believe, the one on the right, and a screen reader user would read through the whole article, and then at the end of the article would come up with this, to this list, latest on Russian politics. When the thing that's duplicate on the page actually means different things, like this button here, there's a different way to deal with it. So obviously, if you see this visually, each of these buttons means a different thing. So the first one is add to my FT. It's adding the Europe topic to my FT. The second one is adding Vladimir Putin, etc. But to a screen reader user may pull up a list of all the buttons on the page. So to them, they will just see 7 buttons that are add to my FT with no context whatsoever. So what you do in these cases is that's sort of your original button. You add some invisible content to it. So that visually hidden class, just what it just means is just it's something that won't show up on the page, just doing it with CSS. But when the screen reader announces this, it will announce add Europe to my FT. So again, we don't need to change anything visually, but adding these little things can really improve accessibility. So one last thing besides letting your developers know sort of what errors to expect and what to do about them is to get some general training on accessibility. This is a really good place to start. It's a free Udacity course by Alex Boxall and Rob Dodson from Google. I'll share these slides later so you can grab the URL if you want. But it's a multi-week course that you can do on your own time, and I highly recommend it. It's where most of us at the FT got started with accessibility. So we've said tools like Pali will cover 20 to 30% of your accessibility errors. The rest of the errors that you could potentially have, or that you already have, require some human intervention, so we'll go over those. To detect those errors and potentially fix them, you can have an external audit, which is just a third-party expert that checks your site and gives you a report of what's broken. You can have customer research and user testing, so users with actual disabilities can test your site and tell you what's broken. Or you can learn to use assistive technology yourself. And these are not mutually exclusive. You should ideally be doing all these. And I'll give you a little preview of how we did some of these. So for the external audit, that was conducted for us by the Digital Accessibility Center in the UK. And there are plenty of companies like this across the world. And I'll show you a little video and see if we have audio. Well, if there's no audio, there's closed captions, so that's fine. So it's a 2-minute video of the work that they did and how they tested our site and what they found. Let's see. This might be it. Well, there's captions. This is the way Rebecca's testing this site is just she's speaking to the computer and saying all these things to control it. If anyone can give me a hand with audio, that'd be really cool. So different ways of testing ft.com. Site is testing with Zoom. So for him to see what's on the side, he has to zoom in at this level with that level of contrast. If anyone can give me a hand with. So this is something that we had. It was a moving image on the side, which is very, very distracting. We should never do that. Controls were hard to find. So it's like cognitive challenges that we had on ft.com. And Mike finally tested our site with a screen reader and pointed out some of the issues that we had. So in this case, we had 2 boxes that announced us read more, and he just, like the example that we saw before, he didn't know what he would be reading more about because they were both the same. So we'll just move on from this one. Anyway, that was a 2-minute video, but we had a chance to spend the entire day with the testers who tested our site, and I highly recommend it if you have a chance to do this, because it will change your perspective forever on how people actually use your site. So anyway, after that testing session, they produced like a 200-page report with all the errors that they found, and we spent a few months fixing all of those. It was basically retrofitting accessibility into our project. And in the end, we got an official accreditation saying ft.com is accessible to AA standard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is really good. We were really glad to get this accreditation. And we were also very glad to be the first in our industry to get it. But this is really a title we don't want to hold alone. So if you know anyone, or we have anyone here from The Guardian, The Post, or The Times, any other newspaper, we encourage you to really get on this. This is really one metric we should all be trying to outdo each other on. Another way to check for problems is having actual user testing. So you may have all the theory right, you may have your accreditation in place, but you really want your new features to be tested by actual users. Or you might end up building something that looks really good on paper and still get it very, very wrong. Lastly, you can learn to use assistive technology yourself. It's really easy, and you can do it for free. I highly encourage it. So these are some of the tools that we use that really come for free on the Mac. We use these at Financial Times. We use VoiceOver as our screen reader. We also test our site using only the keyboard, and we use Zoom capabilities, much like the ones that you saw on that video. So to go over only the keyboard-only method, this is something that really helped us. Because initially we would test our site using the keyboard, and then we would go about our daily lives using our mouse or a trackpad. But what really made a difference in spotting problems was going keyboard-only all the time. This is not something that not everyone was willing to do, but I was very curious to see, what it would take and how hard it would be. Turns out it's very hard, but very rewarding. So this is what my setup looked like last November. So, because one thing we realized is if you're really going to get rid of the mouse and the trackpad and use only the keyboard, you kind of need to print out a bunch of shortcuts of the top 10 apps that you use, or you're pretty much trapped and unable to do anything. But as you do this day in and day out, you will instinctively learn all those shortcuts just by using them, and all that paper will go away. So to make sure I really use the keyboard most of the time, there are different methods that I use, but one of them, when I was on my laptop, I made my trackpad really, really slow, and I removed all the goodies that come with macOS. So it was really uncomfortable to use. So every time I forgot that I was supposed to be using the keyboard and I went back to the trackpad, it was painfully slow, so it reminded me to go back to the keyboard. So it's just like a little extra incentive to remind you to use the keyboard. And I really recommend giving this a shot. If you have a chance, it will give you a permanent awareness of what it feels like to use the web in this way. And you will immediately start spotting issues with your site and other sites as well. So that was lesson number 3. Throw away your mouse. So going back to this list of things that we need to fix, you've learned to use all the tools. You're all set up with your keyboard.
This is CNET, and here are the stories.
Just roll up your sleeves and try to fix everything yourself. No, don't do it. It's one thing I learned. I want to say I learned quickly, but it took me a while to realize this, is that trying to fix all the things yourself is not really the right answer. You're very likely to burn out. It's inefficient because things will always go to production faster than you can spot accessibility issues. And you really are doing a disservice to your team by becoming sort of the accessibility bottleneck if everything has to come through you before it gets released. So what we actually found works a lot better is if everyone's sort of in on it and working on it. So most people will really want to help and want to work on this if they just know that we're doing it and if they know how they can help. So if you can spend some time and some effort on raising awareness and training your peers over just fixing everything yourself. Also, if you have a say in your recruitment process, make it a part of that process. So ideally, everyone, any new person that comes into your team already knows about accessibility or at least cares about it. So this was our old job description that we added in there, and this was our online test. I need to be careful about what I share publicly because we're actively hiring, so I don't want to give too much stuff away. So apologies for marking that out. But anyway, put it out there if you can, if you have a say in recruitment. So yeah, all of that wraps up our lesson number 4. Don't take it all on yourself. Really, the bulk of the work is taken care of if everyone's doing it, if it's a part of how everyone works. So collaborate with not only developers, but designers, QA, and product. If everyone's working on it, it's just a lot easier. It just basically comes for free. Another good thing, another good way to spread the word was making an event out of it. We did this at the Financial Times. We put together this roadshow where we just set up some tables in a common area that we had. We brought some donuts, and we offered an Amazon, like a 20-pound Amazon gift card, in exchange for completing. So basically, people were competing to win that Amazon gift card if they completed a form using a screen reader. That was it. That was all you had to do. Sit there, eat your donut, complete this form. But the only caveat was that this is the form that they had to fill out. So it was blurred out. You can't see very much or anything at all. And so you were actually forced to use the screen reader. And to a lot of people, who stopped by, this was the very first time they had heard about accessibility. They didn't know what a screen reader was. So this was a great way to get all these people exposed to accessibility at the same time. So the form was really, really simple. You just had to fill out your name and another couple things and submit it, and that entered you into the draw to win the Amazon gift card. And so the big takeaway from this experiment, and it's actually one of the highlights of my career as a software engineer. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and it's the best thing was moments like that one. That's Patrick Hammond, if you know him. He's a seasoned developer who's rarely surprised by web stuff. But this was his reaction to interacting with the web with a screen reader for the first time. And we got that same face from a lot of people in the company. So we basically managed to create this space of collective empathy where we had a couple dozen people stepping into someone else's shoes and just trying out the very product that we were building from a different perspective. So it was very powerful and effective in creating awareness. And from that day on, accessibility was a thing that we worked on at the FT. So it was lesson number 5 that we learned. Talk about it a lot. Make it your thing. When you walk into a room, people will remember that that's the thing that you talk about. You never really know who's listening or who's being inspired by you talking about accessibility, and you're probably reaching a lot more people than you think. So if you want to make it your thing, talk about it a lot. So we've said that these things help you make your site accessible, but obviously the top 2 cost money. And it doesn't mean you can't have accessibility if you don't have the cash to invest in those 2. But if you do, or you have the potential to raise some cash to do those things, the only advice we have is we sort of went through it, and being new to the whole thing, we thought, well, accessibility is the right thing to do, so that should be enough to give me a budget, right? So it didn't really work that way. So it's the right thing to do, doesn't really raise you a lot of cash. So we needed to come up with other arguments to support the fact that we needed some money to do those audits. Alice Bartlett has done a lot of research in this area, and she found that avoiding litigation is the only evidence business case for accessibility. You can see her slides there. There's a lot of information on this there. And if you're a big enough company, you really risk getting sued if your site or your product isn't accessible. So normally the cost of getting sued, not just the economic cost, but the PR cost of your site or your company being involved in litigation over accessibility tends to be a lot higher than the cost, like the investment of actually fixing some of this accessibility stuff. So in the last slide of this last slide of the deck, I'll share those links and every link I've mentioned, so you don't need to write anything down. So before we finish, I want to take you back to how this all started for us at the Financial Times. I was on bug duty one day, and I saw, our bug duty has a Jira board. It's the only place in the team where we have a Jira board. So we had that. We had a bunch of bugs in there, and as I was going through the bugs, I came across this card that said, integrate Pali, try out Pali. I didn't know what Pali was. I knew very little about accessibility, but I picked it up. And when I looked at the history of the card, I noticed that it had been bouncing around our board for months. People had picked it up and put it back, and it had been just knocking around. Until one day, my colleague Ben Fletcher, who's a senior developer at the Financial Times, just like me, who just happens to be deaf-blind, he picked up the card and prioritized it and said, hey, this is probably something we should be looking at. So that was lesson number 7 for us, diversity. It will improve your product, it will improve your team, it will improve your life. So Ben's small action really snowballed into us building a better product and getting that accreditation, our team learning about accessibility, and it led to me standing in front of you all here today. So to recap, and to give you some actionable things you can actually do tonight in under 30 minutes perhaps. Accessibility doesn't just happen. Doesn't happen by magic. You have to do something about it. If you want to do something about it today, you can integrate Pali CI into your project. You can give it a very high threshold. It won't break your bills. It will just sneak in there and just start reporting back what may be broken with your product. Train your people. You can share that Udacity course with some of your colleagues. Obviously, taking the actual course takes a couple weeks, but just sharing the link, you can do that very quickly. Throwing away your mouse is something very quick to do. Ideally, print out some shortcuts beforehand, but give this a try. It helps. It's a lot of fun. Don't take it all on yourself. Don't be the, well, it's good to have an accessibility champion. Don't be the only person who's looking at this. So share the load. Share it with your teammates and with other teams in your company if you can. Talk about it. There's a lot of people on Twitter who have a lot of insights and stuff to say about accessibility. You can follow them. That's very quick to do. And if you have a little bit more time, you can put together a roadshow like we did at the Financial Times. It's cheap. You don't have to offer the Amazon gift card. You have donuts, and people will come over and just raise that awareness. If you need a budget, bring up the potential of litigation. I will share some links of actual cases of, for example, Netflix having been sued in the past and other companies that were sued and sort of the amount of money that we're talking about. And lastly, diversity. Unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet to give you so you can fix this in your team if you need to fix it. But if you have a say in it, in your team, just try and prioritize it because it really makes everything better. These slides are available in that URL, tiny.cc A11Y, A11Y for accessibility. So yeah, you can find them on there along with all the links that I'm going to share in the end. A while back, having this be the entrance, the only entrance to a public building would have probably been the norm. But now it would be unthinkable to do this, to have this be the only way of access. So my advice is don't wait until it becomes unthinkable to build inaccessible websites. And the time to start making your site more accessible is really now. Thank you very much.